Right, here we go. Hello everyone and welcome to the Shootout Podcast. I'm your host Ross Baxter and today is episode 45 of the series. And today we've got an amazing guest for you. We're spoiled for choice. We've got incredible arts for you. He's an animator, an author, you name it. We've got Fraser Maclean on the show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to see you, hear you, and say hello to everyone that's listening. So, hi, hello, greetings from Mexico.
Awesome. So everyone, if you're new to the podcast, as always, the Shootout Podcast is a weekly series where I bring on guests from the games and film industry, and we talk everything about student education and, most importantly, obviously, the main guest's journey and so forth, and just their perspective on the education system. If you're new, I'm also doing a new series as well on Twitch where you can watch me live stream my art and my full art process at Ross Baxter Art, so check the links in the description below. Right, so as always, on the Shootout Podcast, I like to give artists shoutouts. So today on the podcast, we have 4 incredible shoutouts for you. The first one we have is Victor Dino, and Victor is a content creator on Twitch. He's an artist as well. So all the shoutouts that I'm going to be giving today are really good Twitch streamers that I highly recommend for you to check out. So make sure to go check out Victor's stream. He's streaming hard surface art at the moment. Of a sci-fi door environment, so I highly recommend to check that out and go check out his channel and his art station as well. All the links will be in the description below. So the next shout out is Carolina Perez, or Perez, I hope I pronounced that right. Amazing artist, really nice person, great streamer. She just finished making a really awesome stylized character piece for the ArtStation Challenge, and she highlighted her journey on Twitch. And highly recommend for you to check out her work and give her a follow and make the most of her amazing stream. The other artists we've got Carl. Carl is also a character artist, but he's also a creature artist as well. And he's also a really funny person as well. He's such a good person to watch and listen to. He makes really amazing content on his stream. And once again, you'll be able to see their streams highlighted on the screen above. And the last but not least, he's an incredible environment artist. We've got Luca, also known as Tix. So Tix is making a really incredible environment piece based off Sony Santa Monica's God of War, and he can really make environments. Like, he has really good sculpting skills. His lighting is really amazing, and he's been making such really good rocks as well. And he's working on props at the moment, so he's doing prop art for axes and stuff to really add depth to his scene. And like I said, really good artists. So all these artists, I highly recommend you check them out. I do apologise if I've pronounced any of the names wrong. I should know them because they're my friends as well. So that's just a bad thing for me as well. So I do apologise, guys. You know I love you. You guys are awesome. But these guys are all really great artists and really supportive as well in their streams. They help. They always ask and answer questions. And when it comes to art streams, these are the best ones that I recommend for you guys to check out. As always, the main thing is the guests. So make sure to go follow and check out all Fraser's work. Fraser, is there any sort of main things that you would like to share? So obviously you got the animation centrifuge. Is there a few other things that you maybe want to plug or just say about?
Well, more than anything, just because of the coincidence, the very sad timing this morning, you and I are recording this minutes after getting the news that Richard Williams passed away yesterday in Bristol.
Yeah.
And if it had not been for Dick Williams and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I would still be working in live action in some area, probably of editing or directing in live action. But
Yeah.
It was purely thanks to the fact that Richard Williams himself, as an individual and as an animator and as a director, refused to believe that the golden age of Disney was over or couldn't be extended or repeated. And he brought lots of the original generation of Disney and Warner Brothers artists, people like Art Babbitt, Grim Natwick, Ken Harris, over to his studio in London to feed their knowledge and skill into the group of people, not only that were working at his studio, but that were working across London in the animation industry. And ultimately, it was that determination not to let the quality and the history and the substance of the animation achievements that these artists had made slip through everybody's fingers. That was what brought him to the attention of Zemeckis and Spielberg when they were looking for somebody to be the animation director for Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And 6 years ago in 2013, the Edinburgh Film Festival, thanks to Ian Gardner, invited Dick Williams to come up to Edinburgh for a celebration of his life's work, as well as a celebration of his 80th birthday. And having only spoken to him for about 10 minutes, even though I'm good friends with his daughter Claire, for the first time ever, I got to sit next to him for a whole evening at dinner and talk. And it's very, very sad to think that the world has lost an individual who played such a pivotal role in reawakening the beauty and the scope and the range of communication of narrative through animation. And people often look at Roger Rabbit and think, oh, well, it was an entertainment. The book itself, from which the movie was derived, was a satire on racism. It was a satire on the oil economy. It was a satire on American values and society at the time of the golden age of Hollywood. And there are a great many things in the narrative of the movie, but also obviously in the technical achievement of the movie that are very much responsible for what we see now, the great renaissance and the great new departures in everything from visual effects to animation being used in research in medicine and science. It would be impossible to overstate the importance of Richard Williams in my animation career, but also globally through his directing work, Thief and the Cobbler, but also his creation of the Animator Survival Kit. There's absolutely no way that you could properly pay tribute to what Richard Williams did and created and meant for me and so many other people. So it's with a heavy heart that I start the conversation, but with an enormous amount of gratitude and respect for a man and an artist that made all these things possible.
Definitely. Like, it's like there's nothing more difficult that, like, especially when you lose like one of your idols and the person that you've looked up for years and the person who's obviously made massive leaps in the industry and it has pretty much transformed the industry, like you're saying. And like there's many artists that I've grown up loving and so forth, and obviously a lot of them are still around, but there's a lot of the ones from the old days when I did animation. So I originally started off with animation, and obviously the survival kit was such a big thing when it comes to animators and so forth. And there's so many different how can I say it, so much great resources that I think, like, this is one of the main topics obviously that we'll talk about today, but it's like making sure that people don't lose sight of what happened in the past.
Yeah, and do you want to? I just want to check. There's a little bit of lag on the signal with the audio. Do you want to cancel the picture to try and make that smoother, or are you okay?
Oh yeah, sure, we'll do that. It's okay. The good thing is I can always edit the video and stuff, so that's fine. So, can you still hear me? Oh, I can't hear you now.
Hang on, I've hit the wrong button, so I hit the. Okay.
Oh, right, okay. There we go. No, that's fine. That's not a problem at all, Fraser, because I can literally just edit it after, because we're not live, so it's fine.
Okay, cool.
So, but once I upload it, then we're all good. But yeah, so like when it comes to obviously when it comes to the podcast, I always just like to start off with like, so obviously you were just telling us there about like one of your idols and so forth. But when did like your industry kind of start? Like when did like just tell us a wee bit about your story and so forth.
Well, if you allow for the fact that the emphasis in the podcast is education and training for the animation industry, I came to college itself in the late 1970s out of high school from a background where all the conversations, or a majority of the conversations around the dinner table at home, were about education, from primary education, secondary education, through to tertiary education, to universities and art schools, because my mother was a primary school teacher, but my father was the founding editor of the Times educational supplement, the Scottish edition, which was started in 1965 when I was 4 years old. because the Times in London had weekly supplements for literature, higher education. The problem with the education supplement was that the system, as with the legal system in Scotland, was so different to the system in England that the larger part of the content of the original educational supplement, which came out every week, was irrelevant north of the border. So Sir William Haley at the Times invited my father to return from London to Scotland and set up the Educational Supplement Scotland offices in George Street, or Hanover Street in Edinburgh. And he was extremely passionate about all aspects of education, largely because of his own experience of the system in Scotland. And he, as a child, had been miserable at school, but he had felt that his university education was one of the great miracles in his life and was one of the opportunities to expand his own horizons and improve the scope of his own imagination, his thinking, his potential professionally. So he was very, very keen to encourage or help people to repeat the successes that could be found in education, but to avoid the pitfalls. And because he was pretty much a workaholic and very, very intent on all these things, the air was just always full of discussion about the triumphs and failings of all aspects of education in Scotland. So that coloured everything for me from when I was a pupil at school to when I was a student, first of all, for 1 year at Edinburgh University doing history of art, and then for 4 years at the Glasgow School of Art, where my major subject was graphic design. Mm-hmm. So from the earliest age, I've never felt that I had to be respectful to the institution of education. At the same time, I never felt that I should necessarily be sitting there taking gratuitous pot shots at it. But later in life, when I was invited to begin teaching and sharing my own experience from the animation and film industries with a new generation of people who wanted to get into those same industries, I did find an enormous number of problems, obstacles, most of which really did not need to be there. And to this day, I still get up in the morning, and that's a big part of my daily fight, is to try and get past all of the aspects of the educational process that are inward looking and to do with the running of the institutions that provide the education, and home in on all of the stuff that is to do with the communication of the skills themselves and of the energy, determination, enthusiasm, passion, whatever you like to call it, that help people get into and survive these industries.
Because, oh my gosh, I'm already excited for this. This is going to be great. I love it when there's so much knowledge, just makes it brilliant. Here we go. Right, so when it comes to, like, obviously, just, like, the education system, so me and you have already had this long discussion about a lot of this.
We have.
This is going to be a fun podcast, so everyone be ready to get your mind just blown of just knowledge. And
fasten your seatbelts.
Here it goes. So when it comes to, I guess, so we'll start it very kind of simple and stuff. So obviously I sent you the questions, so I always like to base things around the same sort of 4 questions, or at least kind of use them as a guide.
Sure.
But we'll start off. So so this is the thing. So we're gonna have to like relate it to obviously the current trends now. But obviously since you're so you're a teacher and you're teaching all this stuff and you're learning what people are being taught, I guess the question we'll start off with is, do you think people are getting taught the right way to learn, or like are they getting taught like how to be ready basically?
In most instances, I think there are significant and worrying flaws in almost all of the available training and teaching, and I think that this is true of a lot of the instruction that's available online. Although, having said that, I think that I know that a great many graduates from the courses that I teach on, they tell me while they're students and then once they've graduated, that in a lot of instances they learn more from tutorials on YouTube and other parts of the internet than they do from their official curriculum. And that always worries me, because the curriculum usually requires a large amount of investment on the part of the student or the parents or the funding agency that are organizing the money to pay for the course. But there are also, I feel, problems and limitations with some of the online training where the emphasis is too narrow. So I think that one of the things people need to recognize, and again, this is timely because of Richard Williams' death yesterday at the age of 86, what I think people need to recognize is that when they're sitting watching Who Framed Roger Rabbit, somebody can challenge me on this if they like, but I would say that between 50 and 75% of what you're looking at was created by students, not by graduates, but by students.
Yeah.
Because famously, what happened was that the one existing animation course in the UK that was claiming to prepare people for the commercial animation industry, when the students who were part of the 3 undergraduate years on that course discovered that Disney were in London and they were hiring, pretty much every one of them got on the bus, went up to Camden in London, got hired, and abandoned their course. And I was one of many people. I'd been in the industry for a few years in the film editing side. I'll come back to that in a minute. But a lot of the other people that I was surrounded by, their degree, their qualification was in medical illustration or typography or graphic design or illustration. And it's important also to remember that Snow White was not made by animators as we understand the term today, because in real terms, there was nobody on the planet, even at Disney, who could create that level of convincing animation in terms of human performance, in terms of the portrayal of the three-dimensionality of the environments. If you compare the later Silly Symphonies up to and including the Goddess of Spring with the human animation in Snow White, there is a quantum shift, a quantum leap. And it was the determination of Disney and his crew and his team to educate the animators to do something, to educate the artists to become something they had never imagined was possible. So the issue of acquiring skills, I think, is very often separate from the issue of what we think of as education, because a big part of the education is influenced by the management of the systems that are set up to provide that education. And in human history, it doesn't matter whether the system is an industry, a church, an educational establishment. We fall in love with the institution and we do everything in our power to support and perpetuate the institution, often once it's run its course and outdone its usefulness. We are very fond of institutions, and I see that happening at a lot of universities. The larger part of the energy, the work, the anxiety, the forward thinking is to do with how to present or maintain the institution. And my feeling is always that what the institution should be doing is talking all the time, every day of the year, with the industries for whom they are providing future employees. Otherwise, there's a serious danger that the two paths will diverge, and you will have the industry, which has, in our instance, in animation, visual effects, film, moving image communication, this never stands still. So I think that universities prefer to have a set curriculum for any subject so that they don't have to constantly update it and revise. But really, I feel it's their responsibility. It's what they're paid to do, to revise and to keep in touch with the industry. So, yeah, there's. I've talked for so long now, I can't remember what the original question was.
It's all right. No, it's great. I preferred letting the guests just do their thing.
Just ramble.
No, but it's so like obviously the main point that we're getting from that is the fact that it's like, because I completely agree, and so like obviously I've been taught by I've always said, so I've been taught by so many great people. I've also been taught by you. I've been privileged to be taught by you and so many great people like Ian and so forth. But I'm also aware though that a lot of my skill set development came from my self-learning, and
of course.
I understand that that's obviously a big part. Like you have to acknowledge that, and you have to make sure that self-learning is something that you're pursuing and doing all the time. But when you're having to do more self-learning once you finish uni, that's when it becomes a bit more, what's the word, like disturbing.
Yeah, well, we were very fortunate in 2016 to have an opportunity to work in partnership with an extraordinary group of people right up to the highest level at Sony Pictures Animation in Culver City in Los Angeles. Um, Back in 2005, I was visiting Los Angeles and having a conversation with James Williams, who until last year was head of the layout department at Sony. And I was doing two things. I was expressing my frustration, having spent 2000 from the year 2000 up to the year 2005, being repeatedly invited to come in and teach at universities and colleges across the UK that were supposedly, according to their prospectus or their website, providing training for people who wanted to get into the animation industry.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, I found that most of them were really not fully aware of what the industry required or how the industry was structured. But at the same time, at the University of Abertay in Dundee in Scotland, I'd been invited by Jackie McKenzie and Brian Robinson to become involved in an extraordinary initiative called Dare to be Digital. Mm-hmm. And Dare to be Digital took a 10-week period in the summer break where many universities are simply gathering dust and, hoovering the carpets. And they set aside a large part of one floor of the building where there were computers in a connected network and made it available to teams of students who spent the 10 weeks developing a working prototype for a video game. And those teams were international, they were competitive, they were made up of students from Ireland, Scotland, China, India. It was really extraordinary. But they had input from all the major games companies, from Electronic Arts, from Sony, from Traveller's Tales, the list went on and on.
Wow.
And I had been the beneficiary in 1984 of a 5-week summer course in 16mm film production when I was training to be a film editor that was hosted by New York University. And the university at NYU has a separate department called the School of Continuing Studies that is there to make sure that all of the facilities at the university are being monetized and used, evenings, weekends, summer breaks. And the beauty of having something like Dare to be Digital happening over the summer is that it gives the students an opportunity between the end of one academic year and the beginning of another academic year, not so much to do an internship, but to have an even wider exposure to people with a whole range of skills from programming, design, story writing. It was an amazing array of small group of full-time mentors, myself and Mark Grindle for script, and then the visiting people from the industry. So in 2005, I was telling my friend James Williams, he's from Wales, he and I both had to do the same thing. We both left our little corners of the UK map to go to London to learn our trade in the movie and animation industries. And then in the 90s, we were both kind of airlifted to Los Angeles to work. But he started out in the valleys in Wales, and I started out in the suburbs of Edinburgh. And in 2005, when I was saying most of the places where I teach frustrate me, but the Abertay University Dare to be Digital thing is extraordinary because it allows the students' connection with the industry. He said, well, that's what Sony feel, because Sony every year receive so many applications, showreels, resumes, folios from students that have been often to very high-profile prestige educational institutions, but who clearly have spent 3 or 4, sometimes many more years being given the wrong information and the wrong advice about what companies like Sony actually do and what skills they actually require.
Yeah.
So Sony had created something called the IPAX scheme, which stood for ImageWorks Professional and Academic Excellence, because Sony's divided into ImageWorks and Sony Pictures Animation. So the I stood for ImageWorks. And they were keen very early on to reach out to all of the universities and colleges that were saying they wanted to provide graduates for companies like Sony and say, look, guys, there's obviously a lot of stuff that you're unaware of or that you're not paying close enough attention to. We, without charging you, will cheerfully get involved in structuring a curriculum for you that does the right thing. And most of the universities were not interested enough even to respond to the invitation.
Really? Oh my gosh, right, okay. Wow.
And when I discovered this, and when James heard what I was describing about Jackie Mackenzie's Dare to be Digital setup, I had argued loudly and strongly, not just in Abertay, but in other places in Scotland, if it was possible to do something that wonderful and that demonstrably productive for the games industry. Because most of the people who went through Dare to be Digital, they won BAFTA awards, they got hired by the big companies. To me, that was a result. And I said, if we can do that for the games industry, we can certainly also do that for animation and film and television. But I was presented at every point of the compass with excuses and arguments of why that wasn't possible. But the excuses and the arguments were all to do with petty politics between different educational institutions and misunderstandings between funding bodies, the authorities that actually validate the courses. You know, a lot of the decisions that are made about the structure or the content of the course are made by people with absolutely no knowledge or expertise of the subject area they're talking about.
Yeah.
And because animation and any movie-related skills belong in an area that is completely unregulated, there is nobody to hold any of the institutions to account when these courses fail to provide that kind of education. So in 2005, Sony said, if your friend Fraser ever manages to get enough money together to stage the film animation equivalent of Dare to be Digital, Sony will provide all the mentors for free, for nothing.
Wow.
And that offer sat on the table for 11 whole years.
Gee,
and by a series of accidents and miracles, Creative Scotland offered us the funding to allow us to create this opportunity in partnership with Sony Pictures Animation.
Wait,
and
it took 11 years?
It took 11 years.
For them to actually provide the funding?
It took 11 years of me explaining to people that this was something we could do, to finding somebody who actually thought it was worthwhile.
That's
yes, it is. I think it's inexcusable. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I think it should have been an opportunity that the universities, all of them, should have been prepared to seize. But this was the problem that Sony themselves identified. They had made a very open and public offer to provide that advice and support, and it had been ignored. But this is true across the board. In 2016, in the run-up to staging what we called the Animation Base Camp, I arranged for 10 different people from 3 different countries, because we were in partnership with the training organizations in Ireland and in Norway, because I was teaching in Norway at the time. Mm-hmm. And I got 10 people from 3 different countries over to Los Angeles for a whole week. And not only were Sony there to say, we really want this to happen, we will provide mentors for story, for production design, for production management, for layout, for editing. We visited DreamWorks, we visited Titmouse in Hollywood. It's one of the big providers for TV and spin-off animation. We visited Disney Feature, Disney Television. We talked with the ASIFA Hollywood people. We went to the Warner Brothers lot and were received by Alison Abati, who was my boss on Space Jam. She is now in charge of the Warner Animation Group.
That's so cool.
We also met with Sandy Rabins and Penny Finkelman-Cox, who were the founding producers of DreamWorks Animation in Los Angeles. All of these people told us, you not only have our support for what you're doing with the Animation Base Camp, you have our support, period. Anything we can do to support the improvement, the encouragement of top quality, skills training. Mm-hmm. These studios all employ people to do educational outreach. The problem is that most of the universities don't want to be reached out to, because for a lot of them it is tantamount to a degree of accountability or a degree of supervision or regulation or whatever. And to be perfectly historically accurate, the reason a lot of these institutions got involved in teaching these skills was not a noble reason. They were under great pressure to develop a new model for higher education that was commercially competitive. So universities competing with other universities for student intake. And obviously, if that is one of your central motives, you'll pretty much do anything to make people turn up and come through the door.
Yeah.
And prior to the digital revolution, where companies began providing software for 2D and 3D animation in the mid to late 1990s, most of these institutions would never have dared to say, oh, we have a degree or a diploma in animation, because animation, when it was created on paper with pencils or when it was created with armatures and puppets, was simply too specialized and difficult. And I don't think any of them would have felt comfortable pretending that they had that level of expertise, because it was such a rarefied set of skills and such an unusual, tiny global minority of people who had those skills. But what happened was that I was away from Scotland for 15 years. I left to work in London in 1985. I went back at the beginning of 2000. And when I left, there were hardly any universities or colleges providing degree education in animation. When I got back, there was hardly a further education or higher education establishment that didn't have at least one undergraduate and one postgraduate course with the word animation in the title. But as I went in and out of all of these colleges and universities, the one thing I never met was anybody else that had worked a day in the industry. And I thought that was questionable. I thought that was really not on.
That's not right at all, especially when what you're paying for and stuff. And
yeah, completely.
Sorry, on you go.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, because it's like, so when we were talking previously, so we were talking about how could I say it? It's like kind of art slowly kind of like fading away in like their like secondary school and stuff. Or I wouldn't say fading away, but it's not becoming like a focal point, and it's not becoming like I guess they're just doing less and less courses. So when I applied for university at the time, I only really ever heard of the places in Dundee, even though I was aware that there was one in Glasgow Cali, but the only thing people ever had like any actual knowledge about and a good sort of amount of knowledge about was Abertay and Dundee. And it's I guess it depends on where you live in that, but it's the fact that there's so little. Well, there's tons of resources out there, but it's down to getting like the right information. And then if people like, the reason why I do this podcast is like to help people make the decision of basically make their decisions better, if that makes sense. Just make it smoother. And when the teaching isn't maybe there, like for example, going back to the point we said earlier, which was there was a lot of stuff that I had to obviously learn on my own. And when you're paying, obviously, so I'm 25,000 in debt based off just student fees. Obviously, I pay it back over time. But there's like other places like in America who can go up to even 90 grand, 100 grand, and if they're getting no value for money at all, and they're getting taught by all these people who aren't technically actually artists or know what the up-to-date trends are, things are just it's slowly like fading away.
Yeah, I mean, the technical term is a scam, but it's a scam on an industrial global scale, and in most instances it's not identified as such, so it can't be addressed as such. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that it's a functioning scam that people are happy to perpetuate is that the role that universities now play in many of the industrialized nations, and also in parts of the developing world, is a role of camouflage. And this was brought home to me before I was a teenager, because of a conversation that happened again around the dinner table at home, where my father was talking about the school leaving age in the UK. And there was a point in history where at the age of 14 in Britain, you could leave school and go into work or apprenticeship of any kind. Mm-hmm. So you could be considered a functioning part of commercial manufacturing society or whatever from the age of 14 onwards. You were economically an adult, or you were in apprenticeship where you weren't necessarily getting a full salary, but you were getting rewarded with a certain amount of training. When they began putting pressure all across the world on universities to compete as businesses, one of the other things that they were quietly doing was trying to please the governments all over the world who wanted to camouflage the collapse of industry and manufacturing in a lot of areas. And if you succeed in persuading people when the moment they leave high school, whether that's at the age of 14, 16, in a lot of places it's now 18, if you persuade them, and a lot of this is very, very targeted, people are hearing from the age of 11 or 12 that when you graduate from high school, you do not go into work of any kind. You go to college, you go to university.
Yeah.
And the word student has been kind of turned around to mean, when you see the word student, it means somebody who's not ready.
Yeah.
And you are ready when we, the institution, say you are ready, and when we hand over the piece of paper that says you now have a qualification in, visual effects, animation, whatever it is. But when in the years following World War II, many industries were in crisis, many economies were in crisis, and a lot of factories were closing down. What happens then is that if you're trying to present to the world what the structure is of your economy, if you can take large numbers of young people between the age of 14 and 24 and magically make them disappear from the workforce part of the diagram, you can say, oh, well, they're in education or training, so they're not unemployed. They don't count as unemployment statistics. And it's one of the best ways in the world of making an economy look healthier than it actually is. But it's also now that students are having to, the structure of the teaching when I was at Edinburgh University and Glasgow School of Art, I received a grant to which there was a parental contribution. And very often people say, oh, well, that was it was a fantastic time to be in education because, the state was saying, the country was saying, we think this matters enough that you should start life with these skills and with that outlook. And I had a certain amount of materials that I had to pay off. I had a bill for all my photographic equipment and my paper and my chemicals and a lot of artistic materials. But I had nothing like £25,000 worth of debt or the 90, 100,000 that you see students leaving with. And I think that's criminal. I think that ought not to be legal, in the same way that I have huge questions about, what a lot of people in the UK question about the American insurance system for healthcare. I think that education is a right, not a privilege in any, sophisticated, civilized, solvent society. And I don't think what we should be doing is creating one generation after another of scared, anxious, indebted, exhausted people. I don't think that's healthy.
Definitely.
But particularly when you look at subjects in the creative industries, it really takes a certain amount of bizarre skill to take a subject like animation and make people miserable with it. That's kind of an achievement of a peculiar kind. But I think that it's always important to look at the structure and the history of the institutions that you're trying to come to terms with. And the institution of education and training globally has been affected by a number of tidal forces in the years since World War II. Of which people are largely unaware. Even the people that are inside these institutions don't necessarily understand how they got to be that way.
Yeah.
And once they're in there, one of the other things that is painfully true about educational institutions is that many of them at the further and higher education level are the few places where you can have steady, constant employment and put money away for your retirement and have a health plan. There aren't that many jobs any longer in any other industry that provide that degree of security. So once people are in there, in teaching or administration or any area, they absolutely don't want to let go, and they will sink their fingers into the cliff face to stay where they are, which means that the priorities in terms of what people are defending and perpetuating are not really the educational priorities or the priorities, they don't match the priorities of the industries, the businesses, the trades, the skills in the outside world that these graduates are supposedly being prepared for. So that's always been my perspective on it. And most of what I see around me in any part of the world still sadly reinforces a lot of that.
Because, this is, there's a lot of questions that obviously that get raised all the time, especially as a student. And so this is one question I've never asked on the podcast. I can't believe I've not asked it. But do you think universities will die out eventually?
I think we're actually watching the beginning of that process. I think that the problem now is that the way people communicate with one another is no longer through any intermediary. there can be direct and immediate publicity about the failings of any course or business or institution. If people are not happy as customers, as clients, with what they're paying for, they can go on Twitter and tell millions of people that they're pissed off about it.
Yeah.
It's a question of what the scale is of the communication mechanism that is putting the story across. It's the power of the narrative. At the moment, people's dissatisfaction is less powerful as a message than the extremely commercialized advertising that all these universities and colleges and art schools have access to. They can spend an enormous amount making everything look entirely plausible. One of the things that happens a lot, even if I am invited to a regional tiny college that really doesn't have an enormous amount of provision for teaching people animation industry skills, even if I'm invited to a place like that for a 2-hour presentation, by lunchtime, there will be images, actually not even on the day of the talk, but in the weeks leading up to my appearance or my presentation or the class. The website for that university will have pictures of Roger Rabbit, pictures of Michael Jordan and Bugs Bunny. It will have stills from Tarzan. And the immediate psychological impact of anyone, a parent or a prospective student, seeing those images on that website is, if you send your daughter or your son to this institution, they can have a career trajectory like this guy who will be in auditorium number 3 for 2 hours on Wednesday. Mm-hmm. And those kind of things do affect people. They think, oh my God, if they've got somebody that worked for Disney, this must be a place that we could safely send our enthusiastic teenage daughter or son to go. And they will see that and be convinced by that, rather than actually standing at the gate asking the people who are leaving with £25,000 worth of debt and no certainty of a job in the industry. They will be influenced more by one than by the other. And, I think, to go back to your question about whether this is going to change, the reason I'm here in Mexico, when I was originally offered the job that I'm doing now, I turned it down because the original offer, the emphasis was very much on teaching in the classroom. And most of what's possible to communicate in the classroom within a higher education timetable, that's not the best way to pass these skills on. But what I argued with the university here in Guadalajara was, if they would allow me to begin building connections and opening up dialogue between the university itself, the student body, and the industry that surrounds the university in Guadalajara and across Mexico, then I would be interested in taking on the contract. And that was how the contract got signed. And since I got here in January, I think it'd be fair to say that at least 50% of my time has been spent with people who run animation studios and visual effects businesses and virtual reality businesses, all the companies and studios that are in their infancy here in Latin America. But in Guadalajara, it's important to begin building a local as well as a regional, national economy for these things. And I've actually got, a job at the moment where I don't have to kind of ask permission to go and spend a day with a company talking about layout, or go and talk to a crew at another studio about the importance of editorial continuity, or all the things that I'm qualified to pass on. And the university I'm working for at the moment, Tec de Monterrey, is happy for me to be doing that, and also to be opening up lines of communication for the students. So that's the first time in 20 years, and it'll be 20 years in January, that I started teaching animation skills in universities.
That's awesome.
And, for the first time in 20 years, I've actually got permission to do that, which is fantastic.
Because that's the crazy thing as well, because it's like, so you teach you teach the right way, you teach the fun way, you teach like the amazing way, and it's like the hands-on, actually doing the craft. And so many people go to these universities, go to these education places, and they're just getting told words, if that makes sense. Like, there's not any actual doing. Like,
I've got one approach, and one approach only, to what I do when I'm invited to teach, which is to share information and advice that I wish somebody had told me when I was that age. Because during the time that I was a student, for 1 year at university, 4 years at art school, the tragedy in the 1980s, and actually here's an interesting, unavoidable, incontrovertible fact. I graduated from the Glasgow School of Art in 1983. I was the first ever student in the Glasgow School of Art to include a screen, a television screen, in my degree show exhibition.
I remember you saying...
and now, go to any of the departments in any of the art colleges and find me something that is not digitized, that is not on a workstation or a plasma screen or whatever. But I was the first person in the entire history of the art school. There were people that had done little bits of documentary filmmaking, little bits of this, that, and the other. People had experimented with, fragments of the potential of what you could do with film, but never in a formal way, and there was no course. I had to make up my own course within the graphic design department. And the whole notion of where we would all go when we graduated was encapsulated in this endless pressure to become famous. That was really the only career trajectory that was suggested to artists and designers. Become a famous fashion designer, become a famous illustrator, become a famous photographer. Famous? What's famous? And the people that I saw, I was at art school at the same time as a lot of the Glasgow boys like Pete Howson and Adrian Wisniewski, and a lot of these people that became very famous painters. And I think if you look at Pete Howson's trajectory, this is all it's impressive, but I wouldn't necessarily say that the fame that has come with the development of his skill as a painter has necessarily been entirely beneficial to him or to any other painter that has become famous or any other designer that has become famous, because it tends to burn out. You reach a peak of notoriety or popularity with what you're doing, and then it kind of fizzles.
Yeah.
And what I discovered when I was able to get involved in movie making, and then particularly when I was able to get involved in animation, was that it was possible to be a visual communicator and work as part of a team. And the lovely thing in movie making is you are allowed as much anonymity as you choose to take, which means that you can concentrate on the work and not on the idea of, what do people think about me? What is people's perception of my thought process? And you mentioned earlier, we're not doing a very good job of teaching children in primary school how to draw or paint or model in plasticine. Yeah, all that stuff. Well, here's the revolutionary bit of news. You don't have to teach children to do this. Children do this almost the moment that they can move. They will, you look at any group in kindergarten, the kids will go straight for the crayons, straight for the clay, straight for the sandpit. We are inherently creative, communicative, imaginative people. What actually knocks that out of us is deep breath, the compulsory education system. And this was, again, one of the things that my father was both notorious and unpopular for as the editor of a weekly newspaper about education. He had a constant assertion of the question, why is education compulsory? Because his feeling was that as a lot of people now believe, and looking at the historical record, we tend to have a kind of split system of education. Those people who can afford to pay for an education which will improve their standing or improve their outlook or their prospects, they can have any kind of training they like. The people who have to take whatever is available and like it are left with a system that is much more focused on the origins of the compulsory education system, which was the Industrial Revolution and manufacturing. And it wasn't about people being able to lead a questioning, thoughtful, fulfilling existence. The whole idea of the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic was to have a sober, literate, numerate, punctual workforce who didn't cause trouble. End of. And if you look at the history of, people ought to remember, people ought to be reminded of the fact that corporal punishment in primary and high school in Scotland was outlawed not by Scottish legislation, but by European legislation. The tawse, the leather strap that was used to administer punishment, not just for disobedience, but for failure to form your letters in the right way at the age of 5. In the 1950s, my mother nearly lost her first teaching job in Glasgow
Right.
because he refused to allow the headmaster to beat a 5-year-old boy whose writing was imperfect because the pencil he'd been writing with was broken. And she stood between the headmaster and the boy and said, "In my classroom, no child gets hit." But that nearly lost her job, and this is within living memory. These systems have so much to do with control of people's behavior and thinking, and we lose sight of it because we think, oh, we live in a free society. We are not controlled the way that people are controlled in a non-democratic structure. But actually, humans surrender themselves to all forms of control. But the idea that we're not encouraging people to be artistic or visual. I used to start my teaching sessions by saying two things to new groups of students. I would say I was unusual because when I left high school in 1978, when I was 17, I was the only kid in my year who wanted to go to art college rather than to university.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say when I graduated from art school in 1983, I was the only graduate who wanted to work in the movie industry. And a few years ago, I realized the second part of that is true. The first part isn't, because there were a lot of people my age in the 1970s at the school that I attended who really were amazing at visual communication, at painting, at drawing, at ceramics, at whatever. But they all had parents, peers, relatives, people around them saying, "Don't do that. Go and do something sensible, something safe for a living. Go and do something where you'll get guaranteed employment." And I was the only one in that group whose parents actively encouraged me to pursue a career in art and design. And again, this is living memory. This is still happening, particularly in areas of economic deprivation. Parents in poor areas understandably want their children to succeed, and they want their children not to repeat the poverty that they've endured themselves. Mm-hmm. So they are bound to encourage them into work that they feel or study that they imagine is going to equip them for, a weekly salary. The crazy thing is that in 2019, more than ever, the world, how many people do not start the day, even before they get out of bed, flipping over their Samsung or their iPhone?
Oh my gosh, here we go. I completely agree.
We are living from the morning when we wake up to the night when we roll our head over on the pillow and go to sleep. We are accessing animated content 24 hours a day. Mm-hmm. And yet I still have to answer the question. People go, "Oh, what do animators do?" Yeah. And I'm like, reach into your pocket, dude. Everything about the interface on any of the apps that you're using, the apps themselves, everything is packed with animated content, with moving image communication. And yet still people are going, "Oh, you don't want to learn how to draw or design." It's just insane. And it's an insanity that the human race can't afford any longer. We need people to be creative thinkers, to be visual problem solvers, because we have a gigantic number of problems to solve. And one of the problems that needs to be addressed is the one that you're talking about in this podcast, which is how do we make it that where energy is being expended on sharing these skills and that knowledge with this number of people, that the skills and the knowledge are appropriate, helpful, productive, as opposed to just time wasting or filler between leaving high school and actually winding up as part of the economy and part of the workforce.
When it comes to so the teaching system and stuff, if you say you were to if you had the power to magically press a button and change the whole thing, what would be the big things that you would change? So the main discussions we've talked about is, for example, so I was talking to Fraser about an art piece, and I was talking to him about my life drawing and stuff, and I was saying to him, right, so I was doing, I think I was doing sharks or dinosaurs at the time, and we were talking about how basically me doing drawing from a computer is so obviously inaccurate because of obviously lack of knowledge of depth and just appreciation for proper form and stuff. And
yes.
Carrying on with that sort of point, is there any kind of main things that all artists should be getting taught, basically?
I think the central issue is observation.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about the quality necessarily or the polish of the image that you produce, whether you're sketching, drawing, painting, whatever the medium is that you're working in, whatever the materials are that you're using. The reason that we create images, we've been creating graphic images, pictorial images, representational images, decorative imagery for as long as we have had the leisure time to put, ochre on the stone walls of a cave deep in the mountains of Spain or France. If you go to Lascaux or Altamira or whatever, if you look at, there's an amazing book called Le Préhistoire du Cinéma by a French paleontologist called Marc Azema.
Okay.
And he and a partner artist called Florent Rivière have taken a lot of the superimposed outline drawings of bison, antelope, mountain lions, and they've used digital toolkits to separate those lines out. And what they've discovered is that the artists that were making these images of these creatures were studying the movement of these creatures 30, 40,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. These are movement studies. They're not just about the structure of the musculature, the anatomy of the animals that the people needed to hunt for food or needed to avoid for survival. They were also fascinated by movement. There's even a cave where researchers for many years couldn't understand why there were all these abstract red marks that seemed to be going in all directions, until they did carbon dating on some levels of ash and realized that it was one of the first ever news reports. It was a gigantic abstract painting of a volcanic eruption that they know happened in that area at that time. So again, as with preventing children from spending time making images, this whole question about what it is that we are encouraging people to do, am I remembering the question right? Sorry, I keep going off at a tangent.
No,
but it's
okay.
a question.
So the question is basically like
you were talking about trying to take information from a photograph or a computer screen and then turn that into an image. And what I was encouraging students to do is to look at all aspects of whatever it is that they choose to concentrate on to study, because you need to focus on something. Mm-hmm. There's a danger sometimes that people will feel overwhelmed that, how do I do a perfect drawing of a tree? How do I do a perfect drawing of a person's face? How do I get the ankle right? Or what do I do about fingers and hands? Or how do I get reflective surfaces, this, that, and the other? The first thing you need to ask is, why am I making this image? What is the purpose of this image? Who will see the image or the sequence of images, and what benefit will they get from seeing those images? So one of the interesting things when I published, when the Setting the Scene book about animation layout was published, I was invited to talk about the book and about the layout process at lots of different animation festivals and events. But I also got an invitation to talk about it at the Edinburgh Book Festival. And in my presentation, one of the points that I make is that the period when I was at art college between 1979 and 1983, there was a colossal revulsion within the kind of cognoscenti of fine art and design against representational imagery. And I was constantly, criticized for my drawing style. And when I went to art college initially, I thought I was going to be a painter. Mm-hmm. I hate to say this, but what put me off the idea was I met a few painters and I thought, my God, these people are not happy people. Yeah. I'm not sure I want to, duplicate that. But I knew that I really enjoyed the process of trying to create an image that we would now think of as being photorealistic. That was my goal with a lot of what I was doing. I had no particular clear idea of why that was important or where it might come in handy, but I knew that was what I got my greatest sense of achievement and satisfaction out of. And for the first year that I was at art college, that was encouraged. But when I went into the specialist area of design and illustration, they were constantly going, no, what you're doing has no style, it has no personality, it has no identity, it's not cool, it's not edgy. And I didn't stop doing those traditional classical observational drawings of perspective, of figures, of still life. I carried on doing them. I just stopped showing them to the tutors that were giving me such a hard time for doing work in that style. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, when I went for the interview at Roger Rabbit, the drawings that got me hired by Disney were the ones that my tutors in the 80s were telling me were shit.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a clear idea of how your image making or how your creative work fits in to the society that you are a part of, then how on earth can you be anything other than confused about what it is that you're doing and what the purpose is going to be? So when I did my presentation about setting the scene at the Edinburgh Book Festival in 2012, a group of people came to the bookstore, to the tent afterwards to get copies of the book signed. And the guy who was last in line was a guy called Ed Taylor, who is an architect. And he said, I went to the same art school as you. And I studied architecture, as 20 years or so after you graduated. And we were told not to draw. He said, we were told that we would be using CAD, computer aided. And he said the knock-on effect is that we have a generation of urban planners and architects now in Scotland who have no spatial awareness.
Yep.
And going to your question about copying images off a screen, if you are using as reference a photograph or a flat image on a computer monitor, there is no point in the process where you are taking three-dimensional stereooptical information and translating that into a two-dimensional image or mark. That means that when you're an urban planner or an architect, there is no way on God's green earth that you can take a two-dimensional sketch and fully understand what that will become in the real three-dimensional environment. So we have a lot of very unsatisfactory, very not fit for purpose structures and spaces that have been created by people, because the sense of three-dimensionality and of space inside a computer in the XYZ axes is eternally scalable. You have no absolute sense of relationships within scale within the environment. So you can zoom in on a detail and zoom out to a global view, with the movement of your finger on the trackpad. Whereas sitting in a real environment, everything is to human scale, because your method of extending your arm and your pencil to gather together the measurements to translate onto the page is a constant process of feeding real-world three-dimensional depth, volume, and structural information into your brain, and then that comes out of your brain, down your arm, through whatever you're making the image with. And you, as an individual, are making those translations between 3 and 2 dimensions, which are absolutely crucial, not just to architects and urban planners, but to clothing designers, to industrial designers, product designers, vehicle designers, animators, movie makers, surgeons. There's nobody for whom these skills are unimportant. And yet we have created all kinds of educational habits and conceits and methods that are self-perpetuating but have no productive worth or value. They're intellectual constructs that affect, and I would say infect, the educational process generation after generation. Every generation produces the new ideas about what's sexy, what's acceptable, what's this, what's that, and it's like, oh dear God, could we not sit back and arrive at a consensus about why on earth we are doing this in the first place? Because a lot of it just becomes routine. People get onto the treadmill of all these sequences of events, and by the time you actually sit down and question it, you're £25,000 in debt and you still don't have a job.
You just reminded me something crazy that you told me a while ago, and this was like, I was so shocked. Sorry to cut you off there, by the way, Fraser.
Oh.
It's just because I want to bring this point up, because this was a big wake-up call for me, and I talked to Fraser about this for a long time. So, a lot of artists, obviously, when they're trying to find their passion and stuff, like they'll be drawing, say, like for example, take my portfolio. I made a sci-fi train. I've made a sci-fi Martian environment. I've made an ornate chair. I've made an ornate mirror, and I'm making a throne piece at the moment. Right. So the only problem here, right, is obviously that's what I enjoy, but my lack of early on through what I was getting taught and bringing the discussion that we're talking about here is my lack of knowledge of, for example, you're saying like the space, the layout and stuff. Like there's so many people who don't know how to do basic things right. Like for example, just painting. They do what's it, 3-point perspective.
Yeah.
And because of that, like you said, relating to your architecture discussion, it's everything's like people are losing all these basic fundamentals and they're not getting taught that. Like for example, so the throne piece I'm making at the moment, right? This is literally like the first piece that I feel has motion in it, and I've brought that based off this discussion with you, and it's that thing that particularly 3D artists, they're the main culprits for it because of they think they don't have to draw, or they have this. They've been brought up.
They've been told.
They've been told not to draw.
A university or a high school that they don't have to draw because the computer does all that for you.
Exactly.
So it's not that they've suddenly arrived at this idea independently. They've had it pushed down their throats. So it's no wonder that people spout what they've been told. But it's all horseshit.
Definitely, because when you told me that, it was like. Even going back to the point that we just said, it's like going out and doing. So I love to draw animals, and so I'm moving soon, and the place that I'm moving to, I can't wait, has a zoo. So yeah. I'll be going there all the time, and it's because of that. Like for example, I think I mentioned to you before. So one of my favorite artists is a guy called Bobby Rebholz, and he's a character artist, and he's never touched 3D in his life, and he's the best creature character artist I've ever heard of. And he does everything on a pencil, and he's slowly trying to learn the digital stuff just because obviously it works within the industry and stuff. But he literally, like, there's so much life in his artwork, and that's the feeling that I want to get across in my art.
Yeah, of course. That's what everybody would want to do. You know, you want to have something that is convincing and something that actually communicates what you were observing and why. I think that there's an enormous amount of gratuitous image making. This afternoon we have a 3-hour open sketching session that we do here in Guadalajara, where we have live music and we get people coming in from the industry, people coming in as students, some kids coming in from school with their parents, and people are able just to sit and draw and have coffee and tacos and beer and listen to music. But a lot of what happens in visual communication, if you're a musician, if you're a sports person, as a child, what you do at the weekend is you go out and you play with an orchestra or a band, or you go and you compete with a team. A lot of what we do when we're teaching people pictorial and visual communication skills, we encourage them to be alone, to be solitary, to sit in their room. And we pursue this Vincent van Gogh idea of the lone genius artist waiting for some bolt of inspiration on some shamanistic level with a connection to the divine productive source of the universe, and you'll get that if you sit for long enough in your bedroom. So my notion is no. I mean, particularly in the animation and movie industries, these are very, very collaborative processes, and we need to get people past that idea that if you're going to make images, that you sit on your own somewhere and just make stuff up. And the problem that the internet has introduced is that the minute you create an image and you make it available to all your followers on whatever app or website, you'll get people from all over the world going, "Oh my God, you're so clever. Oh my God, that's so wonderful." And there was an artist at one of the sessions a few weeks ago, and I was asking if I could connect with, did she want to connect up on Facebook? And she sort of looked at me and shrugged and went, "Well, I'd rather that you contacted me through my fan page." And I'm like, "Oh
my gosh, no way. Really?"
Okay.
Oh,
well, if that's the way you feel about it. And I'm just thinking, how come you've got fans, at that? But the vocabulary of it, the process of it, the culture of it, there are lots of people now who are making images. And when you look at, a lot of people get into a comfort zone really quickly.
Definitely.
One of the things I admire so much about the Disney artists is that between the 1920s and the 1970s, some of the people that were working on Playing Crazy and Snow White were still active in the 70s, the 60s and 70s. And if you look at the movies, Sleeping Beauty does not look like Sword in the Stone. Pinocchio does not look like Cinderella. Mulan does not look like Hercules. But these were the same artists being able to shape shift in the way that session musicians can play French gypsy jazz on an acoustic guitar in the afternoon and go off and do a session to record a high-speed heavy metal guitar solo in the evening, because they are flexible. They're trained to be able to play jazz, soul, R&B, classical, whatever. And the way that we communicate visually, the way that we use images, the way that we use pictures, and the way that we understand and explore our skill set, this changes according to the pressures and the needs and the fashions within any one society. One of the points I was trying to make to my students here in Mexico this week was, any of you that are working in a computer, computers by their nature provide a really good simulation of reality. When you're working with puppets or drawings, you're working with a parody of reality. You're working with a caricature. And if you look at the snow that comes over the Tangshan Pass in Mulan, it's Chinese snow. There are decorative flourishes in the design of the special effects animation by guys like Steve McDermott and other people on the team that did that movie.
Wow.
The water in Lilo and Stitch is Hawaiian water. The smoke dust, or the dust clouds that you see in Emperor's New Groove, are Mesoamerican. The artists look at the traditions and the geometry of the ceramics, the textiles, the decorative traditions of all these, and they incorporate that. You try and do that in the computer, and that's a really big challenge. Although, one of the productions that has really succeeded in getting 3D animation for environments and characters to look exactly like the concept art, even though the concept art was really eccentric, is Jorge Gutierrez's Book of Life. And if you compare that to Coco, a lot of what's happening in the North American and European tradition is still very set on this idea of realism and subsurface scattering and all that kind of thing. Whereas what they did in Book of Life was say, I make really weird shaped drawings. I want to see weird shaped characters moving around on the screen. And I think that's one of the things that really points the way for what is possible if people want to explore more of the potential of the computer toolkits.
Yeah.
You want to be in control of it. You don't want the tail wagging the dog. And the problem with a lot of the toolkits is that they've been created in such a way as to encourage people to produce images of a particular kind, because that's how the software was created. Even as far as the early years of computer animation, all the camera moves looked like they were on an airplane. But that's because the software was developed by the American military for use as flight simulators. It was programmed and designed to look like a flying point in space in a landscape. And it took a long time for the people using the system in the entertainment industry to go, actually, we don't need the camera to fly the kitchen table or the street or the whatever. We can leave the camera in one place and people will be fine with it. But the creation of the toolkits and the fashions and the pressures often has a detrimental effect on people's recollection of why on earth they're sitting down to make these images in the first instance. And I think that's always an important thing to say. Why am I making these images? Who are they going to influence or help? And how do I make the best job of it? And then begin deciding what methods or toolkits or processes to use, not just sit there and think, well, I've got all this software in front of me. I've got to do that. I can't just go down to the corner of the street with a sketchbook and draw, a dog urinating against a lamppost. But why would you not do that?
Yeah, no, that's the crazy thing, because you just wow, gee whiz, this is brilliant. So, how could I say this? So, do you know, so the common sort of theme of artists is that artists are quite so obviously so I keep saying a lot in my lot of podcasts. So I was brought up with sports, so my mindset's kind of different. So I've always been very positive, very outgoing. I'm quite a loud person, I'll be honest. But the weird thing, this is just all kind of formed. Maybe this is my interpretation of it, but it's and based on what I've learned from you. But it's I wonder if the reason why people are so introverted as artists is because of the way they were obviously like you were said in the 70s and 80s. Artists are getting told that art's not the best thing to do and stuff. And then the reason why people go out less and lack of observation is obviously because they're getting told not to do it. But it's the whole sort of typical stress of being an artist, and the reason why people are so introverted and they're not going out observing things is because of all these things that they've just been told over the years. And that's just clicked in my head that I wonder if it's because of that. So the reason why people are so naturally quite maybe shy or quite secretive about their art is because of this build up over the years.
I think these things do feed into one another.